We make sure our Zoom folks are on as well before we actually jump into it. So I'll just awkwardly stand here. Sorry, guys. Are we good to go? Perfect. All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the University of Pittsburgh. I am Beth Schwanke. I'm the Executive Director of Pitt Cyber. And we are so pleased to have you joining us today online and in person for this really important conversation. We are all increasingly aware, and I think most of us in this room concerned by the ways in which AI is already profoundly shaping all of our lives, but often with very little forethought to consequences of bias, inequality, surveillance, and more. And here at Pitt Cyber, we have been working closely with many of you in the room and online about what algorithmic accountability should mean in the local government context, particularly through our Pittsburgh Task Force on Public Algorithms. And we've also been observing with keen interest how different AI accountability efforts are taking root at the federal level. And so it's been exciting to see the attention around AI innovation from the Biden-Harris administration, but also the increasing momentum to address the very real risks from that innovation. And so today we are especially pleased to be hosting this important conversation as the National Telecommunications and Information Administration undertakes new work around AI accountability. With that, I am going to very briefly introduce our keynote speaker because we do want to leave most of our time for remarks and discussion. So please know that you have bios on your seats and also in the chat. So we are honored today to be joined by Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Communications and Information and NTIA Administrator Alan Davidson. The Assistant Secretary is an internet policy expert with decades of experience, and he has been a longtime advocate and thought leader for civil liberties and human rights online. He was previously Vice President of Global Policy, Trust, and Security at the Mozilla Foundation, and he also served in the Obama administration as the first Director of Digital Economy at the Department of Commerce, as well as time at Google, New America, and the Center for Democracy and Technology. So please join me in welcoming Assistant Secretary Davidson to Pitt.
Thank you, Beth. And it's terrific to be here at Pitt. And I really want to say a special thank you to Beth and to the University of Pittsburgh for hosting this event, for hosting us, and for bringing us all together for a timely discussion on artificial intelligence. And while I'm at it, I just want to quickly salute one of the Commerce Department's staffers here, Ellen Goodman, who's sitting in the front row, who was really the architect of a lot of this work. We're going to hear from her shortly today. And I just want to salute her and the other leaders who are here from NTIA, who have really been working on this for months to make this happen. So we're delighted. We're here today because we all see the benefits that responsible AI and innovation will bring. And we want that innovation to happen safely. But we're concerned that it's not happening today. President Biden spoke about this tension just last week at a meeting of the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. And he said, AI can help deal with some very difficult challenges like disease and climate change, but we also have to address the potential risks to our society, to our economy, and to our national security. The President is right. We need to capture AI's benefits without falling prey to the risks that are emerging. That's why we want to make sure that we are creating an environment to enable trustworthy AI. As a start, today it's clear that AI systems, and particularly the massive innovations that are taking place in machine learning, they will create new opportunities to improve people's lives. From the AI that accelerated the COVID vaccine, to technology for visually impaired, to AI-fueled advances in medical diagnosis. These tools are changing people's lives today. Deployed properly, they will create new economic opportunities. They'll defend our national interests. They'll help tackle some of the big societal challenges that we face, like climate change. And we are still in the early days of development of these systems. So it's clear they're going to be game changing across many sectors, but it is also becoming clear, and we're going to talk about this more later today. It's also becoming clear that there's cause for concern about the consequences and the potential harms from AI system use. There are risks to privacy, security, and safety, potential bias and discrimination, risks to trust and democracy, and implications for our jobs, our economy, the future of work. We're already seeing examples of some of these negative consequences from the growing use of AI. Hidden biases in mortgage approval algorithms have led to higher and denial rates for communities of color. Algorithmic hiring tools that screen for personality traits have been found non-compliant with the Americans for Disabilities Act. And AI systems have been used to create deepfake images, audio, video that deceives the public and hurts individuals. These examples are probably just the tip of the iceberg. I think we have an intuition that there is much more to come, and research shows that it's true. Despite these risks, I am optimistic about AI. And part of the reason for that is because policymakers and the public, all of you, are paying a lot of attention, especially relatively, and I think of it as relatively early in the deployment of this cycle. In 2021, there were over 130 bills introduced in federal and state legislatures related to AI that were either passed or proposed. That's a huge difference from the early days of, say, social media or cloud computing or even the internet, when people really were not paying attention. And I'll say I'm particularly encouraged by being here in places like this at Pitt, where we see so many faculty members, so many students engaged and thinking about these issues. You are the reason that I am optimistic because we're thinking about this and it's still early days. The experience we've had with these other technologies should be informing us about how we look ahead. We want to be pro-innovation. We also need to protect people's rights and safety. We have to move fast because these technologies, these AI technologies, are moving very fast. In some ways, we had the luxury of time in some of those other technologies that I mentioned. This feels much more urgent. The Biden administration supports the advancement of trustworthy AI for all the reasons I was just mentioning, but I underscore the word trustworthy. We are devoting a lot of energy right now to that goal across government. Last week, President Biden highlighted our administration's blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights, which provides guidance on the design, use, and role of automated systems. As the president said, this is a guide to ensure that important protections are built into the AI systems from the start. He's called on Congress to act to promote responsible innovation and appropriate guardrails to protect Americans' rights and safety. There are other places in government where we're working carefully already on some of the details of these approaches. Our colleagues at the National Institute for Standards and Technology, NIST, for example, have published an AI risk management framework that serves as a voluntary tool that organizations can use to manage and understand the risks that are posed by AI systems. A range of federal agencies, I think almost everybody in the federal government, from the SEC to Housing and Urban Development to the Federal Food and Drug Administration, they're all looking at how AI affects specific sectors of our economy and society and how the existing laws that we have on the books apply and could be used. But there's a lot more to do, and that's where today's announcement comes in. At NTIA, our role by law is we serve as the president's principal advisor for telecommunications and information policy. That means that we think about not just what the law says today, but what the law ought to say. And that's what brings us here. While we continue to work on the policies of the present moment, as I was just discussing, we're also looking over the horizon and formulating forward-looking recommendations. Europe and many states in the US are moving ahead to address AI risks and promises now. We're here to advance federal policy to make sure we get it right. To achieve American objectives while advancing American values, we need to develop policies to foster responsible innovation. AI systems should operate safely. They should protect rights. We want and can have an ecosystem that meets those needs. And that's why I'm so pleased to announce today that we are launching a request for comments on AI accountability. We're seeking feedback and have launched a request for comment on what policies can support the development of AI audits, assessments, and certifications, and other tools that can create earned trust in AI systems. In the same way that financial audits created trust in the accuracy of financial statements for businesses, accountability mechanisms for AI can help assure that an AI system is trustworthy. In the past, policy was needed to make sure that that happened in the financial sector, and it may be necessary in AI as well. But real accountability means that entities bear responsibility for what they put out into the world. And the measures we're looking for are part of that accountability ecosystem. AI systems are often opaque, and it can be difficult to know whether they perform as claimed. For example, are they safe and effective in achieving their stated outcomes? Do they have discriminatory outcomes or reflect unacceptable levels of bias? Do they respect individual privacy? Do they promote misinformation or disinformation? Accountability policies will help us shine a light on these systems and verify whether they are safe, effective, responsible, and lawful. NTIA is seeking input on what policies should shape the AI accountability ecosystem. Our inquiry addresses topics such as what kinds of certifications do AI systems need ahead of deployment to earn our trust? What data sets and access are necessary to conduct audits and assessments? What designs should developers choose to prove that AI systems are safe? What should the public expect before systems are released into the wild in terms of testing and assurance? Our initiative will help build an ecosystem of AI audits, assessments, and the tools that will help assure businesses and the public that AI systems can be trusted. And this in turn will feed into the broader Biden administration work on AI. I'll just conclude by saying this is vital work. One of our important goals is to create a detailed framework around how we think about these issues around AI development. We need more than an analysis of consequences or a set of principles. We need an understanding, a clear understanding of what the right answer looks like. That's hard, and we will need help. We want your input to help both technologists and policymakers understand the implications of their choices. I can say policymakers in particular really need an understanding of what guardrails to put in place to support responsible innovation. Good guardrails implemented carefully can actually promote innovation. They let people know what good innovation looks like. They provide safe spaces to innovate while addressing the very real concerns that we have about harmful consequences. We know that AI can unleash tremendous benefits. We know that AI can also have tremendous impacts on our society and our rights. People will benefit immensely from a world in which we reap the benefits of responsible AI while minimizing or eliminating the harms. We look forward to your help, all of your help, creating that better world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Assistant Secretary Davidson. Okay, I'm going to ask our panel to join us now. And while we are doing that, I'm actually going to go ahead and introduce Ellen Goodman, who in turn can introduce our wonderful panelists. So Ellen is the Distinguished Professor of Law at Rutgers University, and she is on leave to be Senior Advisor for the NTIA. So we invite you all to please put your questions in the chat if you're joining us by Zoom, and we will take them at the end. And also, we will take questions from the in-person audience at the end. So thank you, Ellen.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Beth, and hearty thanks to Pitt Cyber for being such wonderful hosts. So in lieu of, because we really want to pack in as much substance as we can, I'm not going to introduce properly our great panelists. You can Google them, you can Bing chat them and get some sort of combination of fact and hallucination. I will just say that I will situate them. So Nat Busey is here from industry, Deb Raji is here from the scientific and research community, and Ben Winters is here from civil society. And before we dive in, I just wanted to set the stage with some definitions about what we're talking about here, and then maybe provide a sample use case to level set for why AI accountability is actually very hard. By AI, we're talking generally about automated or algorithmic decision systems that generate outputs or predictions according to particular objectives. Beyond that, we're not being very specific about exactly the technology because the technology is varied. Often the technique will be machine learning, but not always. When we say that an AI system is trustworthy or worthy of trust, it means that the system has certain characteristics, and these have been defined in the federal space, both in NIST documents and in OSTP, the White House's blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights, as roughly safe, equitable, democracy enhancing, respecting of human and civil rights, and also transparent and explainable. We're talking here about how people can be assured, in fact, that a system is trustworthy before a system is deployed and then on an ongoing basis. So that's what we mean by accountability. And finally, when we use the word policies, we mean both regulatory, self-regulatory, or created through incentives and subsidies. And now for the use case, and then we'll dive in with questions. So let's suppose there's an AI system, an AI system that a newish business uses to assess job performance for its existing employees and to review CVs and job applications for prospective new employees. This system was developed by a vendor who trained it on data from similar kinds of businesses. And it says it does a good job of predicting good hires and promotions, and that it's equitable in the treatment of all people. How can the employer who uses this system know that that is true and that they can trust these assertions? And I'll just list some of the things that actually would have to be proven out and that the employer would need to know. Was the training data biased? Was the data sufficiently representative of this employer's applicant pool and employee pool? Is the algorithm using correlations that are ableist or otherwise illegal? Is the employer able to explain the system's criteria to applicants or current employees who want to know the basis for their evaluations? And then the real kicker, what if the system is adaptive rather than locked, and so it keeps changing over time? In that case, even the vendor can't really know exactly how the system is going to be used in context. So those are some of the questions we're going to be struggling with in this use case or in others. And let me start, I'm going to turn to Deb first. So Deb,
Love starting.
so AI is coming at us fast. We're worried.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit from your perspective as a researcher, and I should say, I think as the leading expert on AI audits, about what audits are and how they can be useful in this context?
Very kind, thank you. Yeah, I can speak a little bit about audits and sort of what is interesting about audits as a mechanism for accountability for algorithmic deployments in particular. And so I think I'm in a computer science department, and something that I find really interesting is that there are quite a few conversations that happen about ethics, about accountability, but they tend to be at a high level and they tend to not be as concerned with deployed algorithms. So when you're looking at algorithmic products that are actually out there in the market, they take on various forms, and they're technically not as complicated as the best performing technology that's presented at a CS conference is probably something quite a bit simpler that is practically deployed and in use. And they take on
different kind of characteristics, like you were sort of saying. In some cases, there are these static models that are deployed and updated maybe like once a month or once a year. And then in other cases, the vendor, has a system that they're updating quite regularly and that they're tracking or not tracking. And so the mechanism of deployment, the way in which the systems are released into the world is very different. And so the audit mechanisms kind of evolve in response to that. But at a high level, what an audit is, or an algorithm audit is, which is an audit of an algorithmic deployment, it's effectively trying to measure. So I say that audits have sort of two components. That's how I've been describing it. One is the evaluation component, where we're trying to articulate a set of expectations we have once we release the model out into the world, and measure what that performance or the behavior of the model is compared to what we would expect. So for example, this employment algorithm, you would expect that system to be legally non-discriminatory. And we have ways of articulating that expectation. And we also have ways of measuring the actual behavior of the model compared to that expectation. And so the measurement, the evaluation measurement part of the audit is really important. But then there's also this second side to an audit, which is the accountability mechanism side, where audits are not just evaluations of the system, but they're actually meant to be meaningful evaluations. They're meant to be evaluations that sort of factor into a larger process of accountability. So it's not just enough to measure the discrepancy between our expectations for the system and how it's actually performing. It's really important for that measurement to be meaningful in, let's say, a legal process. If someone wants to raise an anti-discrimination claim, for that measure to be meaningful in that kind of context as well. And not necessarily legally as well. Ben, you've done a lot of advocacy work as well using different types of measurement. So there's different ways in which that measurement can become can factor into a broader process of accountability. But I think those two components are really what an audit is about. You're trying to get a concrete measurement of how well the system is performing relative to expectations, and you're trying to make sure that that measurement is meaningful as part of a broader process of accountability.
Thanks. And so I want to turn to you, Nat, and because you're in a business where there's a lot of pre-release assessments and concern for safety, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about how that works. And then I want to come to each of you before we get to Ben and ask you, what are one or two government policies that you would recommend that could make these accountability feedback loops more meaningful? Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Ellen. Super happy to be here. Kind of a weighty responsibility to represent all of industry in this topic. It's quite broad, but certainly can talk about how it applies in the self-driving space, because for us, the safety is like the first step, right? It has to be safe. Otherwise, customers won't touch our product, won't use our product, and then there's kind of the general safety expectation on the public side. And a lot of times in some of these conversations, it seems more abstract than it actually really needs to be. I was telling Helen this earlier. We've done a really good job as a society of scaring the hell out of people about like AI is so crazy, you can't understand it, and it's gonna ruin your life one day. And I think that's part of what we have to unpack for people. So what we've done at Aurora on the self-driving side is to really make a safety case around why we think our system is safe. And this is not some technique that we developed. It's actually been around for quite some time. And we kind of, I would call adapted it specifically for self-driving. Previous applications have been more like on nuclear, medical devices, things like that. And there's a very eerily similar trend or kind of the description between kind of what happened on the medical device side of things versus self-driving. Like on the medical device side, we'll say like, this is the expectation of the product, sort of what Deb was saying. And in our space, it's the same way. We want to explain what is the expectation of our product. So our product, we want to be acceptably safe on public roads. That is our argument that we are making. Pretty big argument. So then we decompose that into a bunch of smaller arguments that cover everything from process, organization, to operations. So it's not just about, did the engineers do the right machine learning algorithm and do they have enough training in their data set? Of course, that's important, but it's then also, is that thing being operated in the place that it's supposed to be as it was designed to be, and how has that changed over time? And one of the things that kind of I'll highlight, pick up what Deb was saying, so there's a very strong piece in our safety case that has to do with continual. This is where kind of we house all of our safety performance indicators, where we talk about anomaly resolution. So something doesn't meet our expectation in the field, how are we going to resolve that in the company? make sure it gets adjudicated appropriately, all those kind of things that are super important. Again, it's not like rocket science, right? These are things that are definitely solvable. But that's a very important piece because you don't know everything, right? Like we can drive all the time and still not see some things. And that's why it's really important for us not to rely on how many miles we drove or, crazy estimates around like we're X times safer than a human, because we honestly, that's not the right metric. It's an important metric. It's an informative metric, but that doesn't help you say that you've actually designed the system in a safe way, in a way that's going to convince, let's say, our partners to actually use our product in a way that's actually going to convince the general public that it's safe to be on the streets in the first place. And I shouldn't leave out the regulators in this, as a recovering regulator, there is this thing around being trustworthy with them as well. And that's a very important piece of how the safety case concept can work, because it allows them to kind of poke at things that are interesting to them. So for example, they might be very interested, let's say, in how we trained our system and how many incidents we had on the road and all that, versus some of our partners might be more interested in like, what's been the uptime, what's been some of the issues you've had in the field, explain that to me. They're different customers in some ways. And so the safety case concept allows us to kind of give them assurance in a way that they can focus on the things that they want to poke at or be interested in, but not be so overwhelming that they have to understand everything.
Can I just, I'm sorry,
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
to be very aggressive with this.
I know, it's like-
I just want to probe on the acceptable risk.
Yes,
When you talk
yes.
about it, and, we throw around these sort of abstract
Yeah.
nouns of, acceptable risk and risk assessed,
Yeah.
fair. And so is that what your metric for acceptable risk? Is that something that is explainable or transparent either to your customers or to the public more widely?
Yeah, for sure. It has to be acceptable to us first, right? One of the interesting things around self-driving is we live under a self-certification system here in the United States for motor vehicles and motor vehicle equipment. So the vast majority of things that are on vehicles today are not necessarily regulated by some rulemaking or some rule. It really is incumbent on the company. And so in our sense, we have to prove it to ourselves first. Then there's a bar we have to meet with our customers, right? Might be different, might be the same, but that's a journey with them. And then we, like insurance, all of these people are involved in kind of understanding what is that acceptable level of risk to actually have that product be viable. And so there's a couple of different ways to do that, right? There are literally safety performance indicators that might tell you kind of what that risk is, but then there's kind of basics that are kind of binary. You either have it or you don't. So one that I'll talk about, safety culture, right? We believe very strongly that all of our employees need to be buying into this process because they need to be able to raise safety issues that aren't always caught. We got to measure that. You either have a system or you don't. And so that's another way of determining kind of what's acceptable in the broader context of deploying a system like self-driving on public roads.
Okay, I'm still going to come back to you, Deb, on the couple of policies, but let's bring Ben in here.
Should I start with a couple of policies or?
Sure, do that.
I mean, it's only two, it's fine, okay. I think if yeah, exactly. There's several hundred-page documents. I think the two most sort of critical policies that, I think these two are going to be more legislative, but are data minimization and prohibitions on automated systems that just are snake oil, cannot be proven, cannot be substantiated, right? Those are two really simple ideas that are really hard to achieve politically and sometimes feasibly. So data minimization stands for the basic principle that you are only collecting data for the actual service that the consumer wants you to collect it for, right? And that they want you to use it for. And so those use and disclosure limitations, while more a data privacy issue than a, AI issue, they're all really related. And so if you do not have that excess crazy amount of data collection just for the sake of it, just because you can, just because you are allowed to, you will not have as many sort of problematic systems that are built without, meaningful purpose. And the prohibition on AI that just cannot be scientifically proven, backed up. I think the cleanest example would be anything having to do with emotion recognition. On so many layers, there's been, proof that you cannot recognize someone's emotion through just like a snapshot of their face. There is substantial research about how discriminatory that gets. Even if you could think about different disabilities that people might live with. But at the baseline, there has to be some red lines in order for us to be able to operate responsibly and trust systems.
So the needing to prove that something is safe and effective then backs us back into assurance, because then it engages the sort of audit community, third party, perhaps audit community. It also requires standards, right, for what that means. So turning it over to you, Deb, what are a couple of policies that would make AI audits after the fact or certifications before the fact work better?
Work better. But I was going to say, just to plus one, something Ben mentioned, especially the second point around functionality being really important and the effectiveness, just a basic functionality test of like, are the claims being made by the vendor actually happening? There's quite a few recent policy developments. We wrote a paper called The Fallacy of AI Functionality, where we looked into sort of this paradoxical policy behavior that we saw, where people were sort of jumping the gun into concerns around equity or safety, and the basic sort of functionality claims of the vendors were not even validated. So an actual really good example of this is some of the employment AI technology. So some of that technology is completely invalidated. It's based off of personality tests or even sometimes, facial recognition technology in order to assess the hireability of a candidate. And there are sort of basic validity claims to be assessed and questioned. And strangely, for a long time, until the sort of recent rounds of feedback that New York had. So New York, for example, has I don't want to name names. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to name names, but it's a state, or a city. New York City has this municipal bill effectively requiring bias audits of AI-related employment technology. And they sort of, in the first draft of the bill, it was just focused on bias because they were worried about the discriminatory effects of implementing something like that, which is a very worthy cause and a very real concern. But what they hadn't realized was a lot of these technologies would be able to be effectively manipulated into passing sort of the audit or the test. They would be able to fulfill the 4/5 rule and to appear to be anti-discriminatory, but their basic sort of validity of, are their personality tests inputs correlated with downstream job performance was completely, like, they didn't provide any documentation or information about that. And that was really the first red flag in the community of, wait, there are of course concerns about safety. Of course, there's concerns about fairness. But before all of that, we should actually really be questioning what's being put on the market and being branded as AI. The FTC has recently actually really leaned into this questioning of, like, is it false marketing if you say this is AI technology that does a certain thing, but your model or your product doesn't actually live up to its claim. So just to plus one, this sort of snake oil assessment and this questioning of basic functionality is a really important thing. I will say, if I can add two more, I don't know if I could add, that was a plus one of Ben, sorry. Okay, so one that I really want to talk about is, I have actually participated in quite a few audits at this point. And it is a very frustrating ad hoc experience every single time. It's a very difficult thing. It actually takes a lot longer than I think people imagine. Part of it is, data access is very difficult. I know that auditors in every field, from finance to medical devices to transportation, even regulators sometimes have difficulty with getting access to information about, what they need in order to conduct a valid independent assessment of the technology. And that's no different in the algorithmic auditing space. There's a lot of challenges to getting the information you need to pretty much set up the measurements that you want to assess, how well is this technology working? Is it fair? Is it safe? And so data access is a huge challenge. And we have this paper called Outsider Oversight, where we talk about how there's two types of auditors. There's those that are on the inside. And so there's these internal audit teams. You might have noticed sort of responsible AI teams or ethical AI teams at, like, the big tech companies, for example. They sort of play this internal audit role, and their main strategy is just documenting different engineering decisions being made internally. And that's really useful, actually. And sometimes they share that information externally. Often they don't. And so that becomes very difficult as an external sort of even regulator to understand what's happening internally, even though they might have really done thorough work internally, that very rarely makes it out. And then you have these external auditors who are completely on the outside and are trying to, from an outsider's perspective, often just like a consumer level degree of interaction with the product, trying to figure out what's happening with that system. And so the system turns into this black box where you have no idea what's going on. Very typically, you have no idea what data the model's being trained on. Even the evaluations sometimes are not localized to the context you're working in. So even like, let's say in like a healthcare context, you're working in a hospital in Michigan and you have no idea if the evaluations were done or the training was done on a hospital in Boston and if that's applicable to your population. So there's all of these challenges that you have on the outside. And we wrote about how, some of these challenges are things that can be addressed by building tools as a community to support us in figuring these things out. So for example, external auditors, especially those coming from civil society and academia, we now have sort of a suite of resources, open source resources that people have built to try to help them, analyze information or, scrape information from online systems that they need to be able to do these assessments. But there's also a very important policy need for intervention to allow for that kind of access or to allow for infrastructure that would make this whole process easier. So one very simple one that we're advocating for now is that if I arrive at a hospital and I'm suspicious that AI systems are maybe used at this hospital, even within the hospital, the administrative staff might not actually know what's being deployed. Or where it's being deployed. It might be the management of that system could actually be quite distributed. And so even like, requiring some kind of centralized logging or communication around what systems are being deployed. And I know the Government Accountability Office has also written about how, the US government is very organized, but there are certain departments and groups that also have no idea what's being deployed. But the Veterans Affairs, there's been certain initiatives. So I know Veterans Affairs has released an AI database of all the things that they know that they've deployed, that they're aware of, and they put it all in one place. And that kind of resource is, again, a very low lift, but very helpful for external stakeholders that are trying to understand what's going on. And also trying to collect the information that they need to do these audits in the first place. So I would say, yeah, there's a lot of things that can happen on the access point of just visibility and access really being two major roadblocks that prevent external auditors in particular from getting the information that they need to conduct an audit at all. So I would advocate for those two policy directions of just allowing external perspectives to get any kind of visibility into what's deployed. And then also, protecting them and mandating a certain visibility to what's happening on the inside, either through, and again, it could just be as simple as giving external parties access to what the internal auditors have already done, or visibility into what the internal auditors have already done, which is currently right now like locked and key, not very visible. It could be as simple as that. It could be as complicated or as interesting as allowing those external stakeholders to demand the information that they need, whether it's information about the training data or direct access to that data or direct access to the algorithm itself to be able to probe it and understand how it is expected to behave in the context that they're evaluating for. So yeah, all this to say, access and visibility are probably the two things that I think pretty strongly about as policy directions that you can go into.
Thank you, Deb. I prepare your questions because in 5 minutes we're going to take questions from first from the physical space and then or simultaneously the online space. I should say for the federal government, there's an executive order that requires all agencies to provide an accountant or a registry of their AI systems. So they're coming out. Now, let me turn to you because you were a federal regulator and just, if you could just give us some insight about where you think the federal government could be useful, either in, it doesn't have to be regulation, but it can also be sort of priming the pump or, helping to support some of the accountability mechanisms we've talked about.
Yeah, it's a really, really great question. I think there's the the power of the federal government, I think, in some of these regulatory agencies, is pretty impressive, actually. And I think maybe tying a couple things then Deb said with what the Assistant Secretary said. So guidance actually is super helpful. I think sometimes we discount how powerful guidance can be to companies, particularly in a new and emerging markets and fields like we're talking about here today. So the example in my previous life, circa 2013, there was these guys out in California called Google at the time who were putting people in cars and driving up and down the 101. We were like, what are we going to do about that? And so we put out some guidance, and that guidance has been massaged and reiterated by now several administrations now. So that's to tell you how impactful something like that can be. And I will tell you, initially industry was like upset, right? Because at least on the self-driving side, we have a very healthy tort system here in the United States. And so those things can sometimes be abused on the other side. And so I think there's a role there that government can play to kind of say, here's what we would like to see, set those expectations for our companies, but somehow try to balance it on the other side so it doesn't become like a hammer that's used for companies that are actually trying to do the right thing. I think there's a second piece around kind of making adherence to those things possible. So the oversight sometimes wanes depending on who's in administration. Sometimes there's lots of oversight, sometimes not, whatever. I'm not going to get into all of that. But the case in point being, it's also a tool in the toolbox that doesn't necessarily need regulation. And I think one thing I struggled with in my previous job, and even today, is everybody knows external audits and assessments make sense, but it only makes sense when it's mature. In a lot of cases right now, I think in this particular field, where it's nothing to say that the assessors out there are bad ones, so we're sometimes training the assessor to do the assessment. The way we've handled that internally at Aurora is we actually have, like my team, the safety team is an independent function, directly reports to the CEO. We're not under product, we're not under end. And so we serve as that kind of internal red teaming, so to speak, asking hard questions, but we're also setting the overall safety strategy. But we didn't take the crutch of like, what is nobody out there, so we're not going to have anybody to talk to. We actually had our safety case framework peer reviewed a couple of times now already and took that input as a way to make sure, strengthen our argument, to make sure that as the engineering teams are making evidence to support those claims, we could actually have that traceability to someone want to come in and ask. But it is a way to kind of ensure robustness. But could we take all of our evidence and like give it to somebody and say, have fun with that, try to figure it out? That's probably not the way it should go. And so there's kind of these two pieces. And the way I would kind of sum it up is like some regulatory humility is also needed in this space. Regulations take a long time. Legislation takes a long time. I've been worked on rulemaking that took literally like a decade or longer. And so one of the things I think we have to avoid in this space in particular is this idea that we know all the answers today, we know what needs to be regulated, so let's just write that, as opposed to kind of maybe something that's, let's start some floor, whatever that floor may be, that, it's of course informed by public comment and everything else, but that we kind of mature that over time as we get smarter, because we have to get smarter. What you might think is good regulation today, or maybe I'll put on back myself, 10 years ago, if I thought what would have been a good regulation would not have written today. It's just not the same.
This will be my last question, and it's open to everyone, and particularly Ben, I'd like your views as a civil society representative. We talk a lot about, and the AI, the Blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights talks a lot about participation, affected communities participating in the development and deployment of AI systems. We see that with ChatGPT, that affected people find things about ChatGPT that might not, that other people don't see. And so it raises a lot of questions. So it's obviously a very difficult question about how do you engage communities in deciding whether or not these systems are okay, whether they are worthy of trust, when there are technical barriers, there are resource barriers, there are all kinds of barriers to participation. And I guess it's also a question of when we're assessing these systems, how do we tell whether they've done an adequate job of not just soliciting, but actually listening to community participation?
Yeah. I think going back to Deb's point, like it's kind of impossible without even a base level of transparency, right? And so like I think of two major layers of transparency, being one, that a system exists and is being used, period, right? Like that is not always the case. You don't always know that an automated system, an algorithm, whatever the system may be, is being used, period. I think we see a lot of that in students that had to go online during coronavirus unexpectedly, and they're proctoring programs, and you don't even know what sort of systems, how those are working. You do that in hiring. And in all of these circumstances, there is an immense power imbalance, right? As a student, as an applicant, you're not really in a position to like demand this information about how a system works, right? Or whether it's been tested for bias and what's around. And so I think that sort of requirement about transparency in a meaningful and clear way at the point of interaction is like critical. And we see that reflected in state level policies, right? So Colorado Privacy Act, for example, that's the regulations are written by the Attorney General and it's going into effect in a few months. That and California's Privacy Rights Act both had elements that, in addition to a right to opt out of certain automated decision-making systems, a right to meaningful information about the logic of the system, I think is the language they used, right? And so that's huge. I mean, it's really the devil's in the details about like, you could imagine there's all these complicated things about how do you actually disclose that meaningfully and in a way that is at a place where you can opt out. And then if you are actually using your right to opt out, are you being discriminated against? And not even discrimination in the sense of, based on protected classes, but based on just exercising your right? Like if you are applying to a 1,000-person company and you are one of 100 people out of 10,000 people that opted out, 10,000 applicants that opted out of the automated decision-making system, like you may not actually get interviewed, hired, and you don't actually, it's really hard to like track down the decision-making thing, even if you could. But there's no mechanism that requires entities, even, that are touching at really sensitive points of really, these contexts in which the power imbalances are extreme and there's this history of rampant discrimination. And so I think that is like the very first level, right? Like getting people to understand what systems are being used around them. That is like both by the government, I think is the easiest way to do that, right? Like the Executive Order 13960 tried to do that, is maybe going to do that eventually if the other agencies besides a few of them comply, or if it's required by legislation, which I think it should be. But that would empower communities, organizers to explain to residents, this is what's being used. This is how it might impact you. These are the rights you have to fight back about it, right? And so I think that's one way. And then, I think in a very basic sense, hopefully as awareness of automated systems increases, which I think it is, in the way, we saw examples of it messing people's grades up and therefore their college decisions. We've seen where there has been faulty predictions for a kidney transplant, which makes Black people get lower on the list of a kidney transplant. Like we're seeing these really horrible examples of automated systems. We see it in the outputs of ChatGPT, right? And so I think that as the consciousness sort of rises, there's hopefully sort of political demands from lawmakers, constituents to help sort of advance policies. But I think awareness and transparency is like a very baseline thing that you can't even start that conversation without.
I wouldn't add much to that. I would say like to the point around information asymmetry, like I think I would also add education too as well. Like a lot of communities that I've interacted with are just not aware of some of these potential consequences. And like you said, even if they are notified that an algorithm is being used, which is super, super rare, they might not understand that it's technology that could have discriminatory outcomes on them, just because of not like being familiar with the concept of algorithmic bias and all these things. And so there's an education component. The other thing I was going to add, just from like a practical policy lens, is that there are these incident databases that have an increasing number of sort of algorithmically related cases attached to them, where if people are notified that an algorithm is being used, or they come to know that an algorithm is being used and they've experienced some kind of adverse effect or negative consequence, it's really hard to understand who to talk to or who to approach. Like sometimes you have some level of awareness of civil society groups like EPIC, but typically people don't know where to go. And I know Like, the FTC, for example, has, an incident reporting database for like credit fraud, and, FDA has adverse effects reporting database for if you experience, adverse effects from a drug or from the use of a medical device. And so I can see some of these systems easily extending, or maybe a separate system related to algorithmic related harms, but something existing to just be a space where the general public can become aware of, okay, if I experience an adverse effect because of these systems being deployed in a way that was inappropriate, there's some reporting mechanism, there's some way to just flag it for either a regulator or some authority that has some level of accountability. And so I feel like that's another part of the issue where people will sometimes come to know something happened and they won't understand who to approach or who to address their concerns to. And I guess the last thing I was going to say around sort of general participation and engagement is that a lot of communities also could contribute in other conversations as well. A lot of the standards development conversations are very, at least in my experience, very corporate heavy, in the sense of there's a lot of corporate participation in the process of articulating what expectations we should have for these systems. But there's maybe a role for community members or community organizations, civil society orgs to be much more involved in that process. And I could see that being a really meaningful direction moving forward as well.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. And I think that a lot of it goes back to the transparency thing, right? I think if companies are transparent with what they're doing, then it's easier for those folks to get involved and have a seat at the table. I think the one thing, speaking about communities in general, also is we shouldn't assume they know what questions to ask. And I think if you look across the ecosystem, whether that be John Q. Public, all the way up to the regulators, I think if there was a way to formulate, well, here are like maybe the top 3 questions you should ask about the thing, that could go a long way, I think, and also kind of just contribute to advance the conversation so that it doesn't become a corporation versus citizens or corporation versus regulators, because I think we've all known that technology doesn't really wait for anybody. And so everybody needs to kind of be talking and discussing these issues.
Questions? No.
Thank you, everyone. This was an interesting talk. I'm fascinated by all of this. So I have a question about the use of the word trustworthy and sort of in algorithms and sort of general automated decision making in general. So I guess my question is really around the vendors, and is the expectation that we see a lot of times in sort of predictive models that there is an element of there's this automated element, which in general has been really poor because nothing's perfect and we always have to do it under a human evaluator who's making a decision. On the other hand, humans are biased. So how do we know that sort of the machine's doing the same thing? So I'm curious about just the perspective of when we say trustworthy, like what are we talking about? Is this going to be one of those things where you just sort of let it go? Is it a maintaining thing? Is it a under a human sort of implementation thing? And if so, then what are there additional layers that we have to build in to enforce and make sure that it's being implemented correctly or used correctly?
Let me just quickly repeat. You're asking, the question is about trustworthiness. Who's responsible for that, and at what point in time do we look at that?
That was much better said.
Go ahead.
Okay. I was going to just mention the ACLU has a really great blog post about the language of trustworthiness, because that was really prominent in like the initial drafts of the AI risk management framework that NIST put out. And I thought that their take was really fascinating, where they were sort of talking about, the technology itself doesn't necessarily have moral properties like trustworthiness, like AI itself. It's not a human, we can't trust the technology directly, but it's really a comment on the institutions and like how trustworthy are the institutions that are making use of the system and the institutions that are building these systems. And so if we have, expectations around procedures that they should be going through before releasing or deploying these systems, if we have expectations again of certain behaviors or practices that they should be engaging with, like how reliable are they in terms of fulfilling those responsibilities? And they had some really interesting examples as well, because there are some, there are a variety of algorithmic products. And so when we say AI, it's always very vast umbrella, but for automated decision systems, so these are systems that are used by like an institutional user typically to make decisions about sort of this third impacted population. So think of, a firm that's using employment risk assessment or technology to make a decision about, job candidate. And the job candidate really doesn't have a say in the whole process. Like the user of the technology is the firm. And so there's responsibilities that firm has as a user of that technology. And there's a sort of concern that the vendor has for their user that they might not have for this sort of third party impacted population. So like the criminal justice context, for example, where the police is the user and the impacted communities are separate from that user. There's a lot of instances where, you have requests to make from the user itself. So like the Post Act in New York City was very much oriented around NYPD sharing information about the technology that they're using, because as users, the vendors were sort of prioritizing their needs. And that was, incentives were sort of aligned between the vendor and the user, but this sort of third party impacted population was left out, and regulators needed to step in to make sure that that third party was protected. So I think that there's a couple of these instances where the user has certain responsibilities and needs to be trustworthy and acting in a trustworthy way. And then the vendor, of course, like we've been talking about this whole time, as they build the technology, as they validate the technology, or as they communicate about the limitations and the performance of the technology, that communication needs to be trustworthy and validated and real and all of these things. So I feel like I really align with that view of like, it's not necessarily the technology itself that's trustworthy. It's these various institutions and stakeholders that actually have responsibilities and need to act in a trustworthy way.
Dan, let me get the last question and maybe you can,
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm adding another wrinkle to this so let's assume in our initial setup where we have a vendor. Well, it's very helpful if the vendor is US based, but what if it's international based? What if the vendor is you're purchasing a software product from a country that you don't even realize it's a vendor outside of the US. So I was kind of wondering, and I'll just keep it short because I think much longer question about civil society research industry. What types of conversations are occurring on that sort of not only with your colleagues in the US, but broader, across the globe? And is there any kind of movement intergovernmental to sort of address the problem that exists in a contiguous 50, for contiguous 50 states, but it's a broader problem or curved issue?
So the question is about trans-border accountability.
Yeah, I think one way you can address that is through voluntary industry standards, right? So that's super helpful because, for example, in our space, we're dealing with that right now, not Aurora specifically, but the broader industry. And so we have a cross collection of international companies, domestic companies that are all working together on very specific aspects of safety related to self-driving. That sort of is a way, not the only way, but is a way. And the trustworthy thing actually speaks to this as well. So like in our instance, we actually have taken a very broad view of trustworthy that includes all stakeholders, including where we're buying our stuff from, to kind of make sure that, and our partners and vehicle partners, all those kind of things to make sure that we are informed about what we're taking responsibility for basically, but also what we're putting on public roads.
I think one part that I wanted to touch on with that answer sort of both questions is like one question we're constantly grappling with when considering enforcement or legislation or other regulations is like who bears the responsibility, right? Liability wise, legally, right? There's the general sort of question about who the consumer should trust and stuff, but someone has to be accountable, right? And there are good arguments on both sides. I think industry users, like a company that's using a hiring vendor to do it, doesn't want to be liable. They want to kick that down the road probably. But more and more, and this is happening worldwide, like this is, not within any borders, like it is just going to increase the amount of third-party systems that are in common, consumer applications, right? And so that has to be really like carried out, like, and the end user that is making the impact, I think, should be probably the one held accountable, and hopefully based off of that, that requires the vendors to be more responsible, because if someone gets hit with something and they're using one company, hopefully and logically the other companies would be like, we're canceling our contracts with you. We don't want to get hit with that same lawsuit, right? I mean, that's like where we live in a deeply capitalist country, and so like when money and enforcement and bad PR is the that has to to a certain extent drive this, right? And then the other thing about the transport national thing, I think a lot of other countries are farther along in their culture around privacy and AI than we are. There's a lot in India going on. There's a lot in the EU parts. And one thing that the Department of Commerce is doing, they're part of a tech something council, TTC, transatlantic. Yeah. And so that is negotiating treaties and stuff like that on privacy and AI, especially as the EU AI Act continues to be developed. I think I keep going back to like what party has to be accountable, what party has to be trustworthy. I think it should be the US user or the user / company using it in the US. So yeah.
Let me conclude with one last question, which is a very deep question from an online participant. I'll paraphrase it, but I think it sums up a lot of sort of a meta critique of the conversation we're having, which is, how do you hold companies accountable for AI that they're using? This question asks, should they be using it at all? And this question asks, what is the responsibility to the public to not deploy a technology with enormous downsides and near-term job loss as an example of the downside, but we could add to that safety or disinformation or whatever the domain is. And so the question really is, how do we think about that question? I think there are accountability features to that question, because like Ben, you talked about, it shouldn't be released until, and that's a kind of certification or sort of pre-release audit that has to happen. But if any of you want to respond to this question, which it also is called right by the letter seeking a moratorium, at least on generative, the large language model, generative AIs. So any of you want to address that? How do we think about that?
I have a small comment, but I'd be curious to hear what the others think. Because my first sort of audit was on a facial recognition product. And facial recognition is one of those technologies where it's harmful when it doesn't work. People get misidentified disproportionately, and that puts them at greater risk of facing consequences that they don't deserve to go through. And it's also problematic when it does work. It's, huge privacy concern. Facial recognition isn't like a fingerprint, it's passively collected. And we also, I don't upload my fingerprints to the internet the way I do my face. And so there's a lot of very specific privacy risks that are unique to facial recognition. And there's sort of problems with the technology just existing. And something that I learned from that process is that in terms of getting immediate action, to remove something that's prematurely on the market, the argument around this doesn't work, it should be removed from the market, I think is a great initial argument. In the case of facial recognition, what it did was that because people thought for a very long time this technology works, and our audit effectively showed that it does not work for like marginalized identities, so that it works less well on darker skinned women than it does on lighter skinned men, for example. And as a result, a lot of companies pulled certain products off of the market. And that actually slowed things down in a way that allowed for the bigger conversation around, okay, well, wait, actually, how are people's spaces being stored? Wait, actually, how did you source these spaces? All of that conversation came very quickly rolling afterwards. So once the products were off the market, the conversation actually started of, the bar raised before it was able to even be considered to be put back on the market. And so I feel like that's an approach that I've been thinking about for a lot of these technologies, where a lot of the foundational claims around performance, around being fair or being safe, are valid questions to start with. And then there's more complex investigations, even moral reasoning to be made around should this technology exist. And that's almost easier when we're not dealing with a project that's already deployed or a product that's already out there. At least that's been my experience personally so far. And so I do think that it's important to ask the questions that we're asking today, but that question of should it exist at all or should it be deployed is definitely on the table and definitely should be considered, especially for technologies. Ben also mentioned some technologies in emotion recognition space that are just fundamentally dubious, but also just their existence is sort of causing certain harms. So some of these like more fundamental questioning of should this technology exist can actually arrive once the technology is, not out there, not deployed. Because I find that sometimes what happens is that the vendor makes claims around the performance of these technologies. Those claims are believed. The technology is massively deployed, and while it's already out there, people are having debates of whether or not we should claw it back. And I'm like, okay, we have like really strong evidence for the technology not actually living up to its claims. We can use that to pull it off of the market, and while it's off of the market, we can have these longer term debates about what it takes to validate its existence on the market in the first place. So that's my take, but I'm curious what you guys think.
So I think I agree with pretty much everything you said. I think one element of the question I found interesting was like, who should bear the responsibility here, right? That's kind of why, like, one of my top two things to do is that the government should not allow certain technologies that we know cannot be done, or even, so there's two types of things, right? Cannot be proven, cannot be done, and will just result in a lot of bad outcomes. And then even if it's perfect, even if it's 100% accurate, facial recognition as an example, you could argue different ways, but could be easily used as a tool of like mass suppression, right? And so you have to have those discussions at a political level, and there should be some standards of red lines, right, from the government. In terms of users, I'm always, we've been using users, end users, people a lot. Users as the companies that are using AI systems, whether they create it or not. I think they should hold probably the most responsibility, right? And so if we look at some of the more recent like frameworks in order to build strong AI, like NIST, their AI risk management framework, as well as the White House's Bill of Rights, they are recommending very explicitly, like as part of your risk assessment about your system, like basically they're saying set ground rules, and if it goes outside those ground rules, don't deploy it. Consider not doing it, right? Like that has to be on the companies. In terms of like the end users, people, the public, I always really hesitate to try to put a substantial responsibility of people like, oh, well, I guess if no one used ChatGPT, it wouldn't be popular or whatever. You can't really put that on the end users, on the public. Obviously, I think a recommendation would be not to use it for wide scale disinformation, misinformation, harassment, fake porn, but a lot of that stuff is illegal and for good reason. And it kind of gets like reflective of just everything, right? People shouldn't do misinformation and horrible things.
Just to add on to that very quickly, like I think what you're getting at too is something that happened with facial recognition policy, which was people just ended up restricting specific use cases. And so with facial recognition, it's like especially dangerous for face surveillance, but face verification on your phone, for example, or face verification to enter like a restricted setting, a restricted government building is perhaps less dangerous. It's just database matching. And so the way that policy actually played out in terms of, restricting deployment was restricting use cases. And I can imagine a world like that for large language models, where there are very high stakes use cases where I do not think that technology is mature enough to be deployed. A lot of medical use cases, a lot of legal decision-making use cases, for example. But playing around with these technologies in like a more like casual sense might not be as dangerous. And so that's one strategy that I've seen like policy-wise play out. Then again, that doesn't address the privacy issues. And
We're gonna start losing people, so let's let Matt have the last word.
No, and I think what I would say is we shouldn't like cast all the technologies in the same boat. Again, I don't want to like kind of make it all about self-driving, but there is a role for government industry to kind of work on these things. And like in our case, there's 40-some thousand Americans dying every year. Like there's a huge societal cost to driving around. We should probably not have that be, what we accept as a society. But there's also other impacts that we have to think about, where there's absolutely a role for government to help manage and do that impact. And I'm sad to say that it's an area that we actually haven't done very well historically as a country, for sure.
Great. I want to thank the panel and thank you all for being here.
Oh, no.